Hello and welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political talk show focusing on the Middle East. Chuck Hagel, described as, quote, a no-nonsense defense secretary, has resigned. President Barack Obama discussed with him the appropriate time to complete his service. He was also the one Republican in the White House national security setup. But that may be of lesser importance than him being appointed to do one task in the Pentagon, only to find out that the job description has changed fundamentally. He was the man appointed to bring the troops home and pare back the huge defense budget. But then Islamic State came along and all the calculations changed, and Mr. Obama and his defense chief found themselves at odds. There was a lack of clear strategy, perhaps because Mr. Obama and Mr. Hagel did not agree on what it should be. And after midterm political defeats, the president needs a military win. So a change at the top will be an important symbol of that determination. But will this help the president repolish his image, particularly when it comes to foreign policy? Let me first welcome our guest here at the studio, Mr. Kenneth O'Keefe, a former United States Marine and Gulf War veteran and commentator. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I shall wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And before we get into our discussion, let's have a look at this brief report on recent events in Washington.
On Monday, US President Barack Obama announced that Chuck Hagel would be stepping down as the US Secretary of Defense, just less than 2 years after taking the post. The announcement came as no surprise to many, as US media had reported of rising tensions between the White House and Mr. Hagel over issues regarding the Middle East. At the end of October, Hagel had written a memo to the White House which was said to be highly critical of Obama's perceived fight against ISIS and his lack of strategy towards Syria. The New York Times suggested that Chuck Hagel was stepping down under pressure due to his handling over ISIS, while other reports claimed that Hagel's exit resulted from conflicts with National Security Advisor Susan Rice and a lack of confidence in his management skills at the Pentagon. White House officials speaking to the press on conditions of anonymity said that the president's removal of Chuck Hagel was, quote, a recognition that the Islamic State would require a different set of skills than those Hagel was brought on to employ. In an interview with a Phoenix area radio station, Senator John McCain said Hagel was very frustrated with the Obama administration's foreign policy strategy in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, adding that Hagel was, quote, never really brought into the tight circle that makes all the decisions. Hagel, a Vietnam War veteran and former Republican senator, is to stay on until his successor is confirmed, with Robert Work, Ashton Carter and the former Pentagon policy chief during Mr. Obama's first term, Michelle Flournoy, as potential replacements. Whether Mr. Hagel was pressured to leave office or chose to resign still remains speculation, but what implications will his resignation have for the Middle East, and will it impact the administration's strategy to fight ISIS in Iraq and Syria?
Kenneth O'Keefe, California Republican Howard McKeon said, he also chairs the House of Armed Services Committee. He said that when the president goes through 3 secretaries of defense, he should ask himself, is it them or is it me? What do you think?
Well, indeed, it's all about image, really. I don't see any major change in policy from the Secretary of Defense position from Donald Rumsfeld and previous to that as well. Really, the policy remains quite consistent. You hear about Chuck Hagel being referred to as a no-nonsense kind of guy. Well, that was the hope, and as an ex-Marine myself, an enlisted Marine, not an officer, which Chuck Hagel is the first Secretary of Defense to actually be an enlisted Marine, a working man's military man, or an enlisted serviceman. There was hope that he would reflect the interests of the people, the boots on the ground, as it were. He didn't do that at all. He carried on the same insane policies which have led to the creation of ISIS, which under his watch, ISIS grew further.
And John Sopel, the BBC's North America editor, believes that after midterm political defeats, the president needed a military win. Can we really assert when it comes to political defeats that the P5+1 was a failure?
Well, I don't think it's a failure at all in terms of what the real policy is. Now, the stated policy and the real policy is almost always 2 very different things. The real policy, not the stated one, the real policy is to punish Iran, and that punishment has been carried forward since the 1979 revolution, in which they kicked out our puppet, the Shah. And also they have the audacity to exercise their sovereignty by exercising another right, which is the right to produce nuclear power. And we look at Israel and the policy towards Israel and the sheer hypocrisy of the inspections for Iran and none for Israel. We see that Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons, has even threatened to use those weapons against non-nuclear states. And we see that the policies of the United States have been consistent in protecting Israel and other imperial policies. Chuck Hagel made no difference whatsoever. The next Secretary of Defense, whoever it is, won't make any difference either.
Chuck Hagel did criticize a little bit what he referred to as pressures from the Israeli lobby in the United States.
That's about as much as he did, yes. At least he helped shed a little bit of light on that fact, but he didn't say or do what he should have done. The policies towards Israel are very self-destructive. They do not benefit the United States. You've got 22 American servicemen and women a day committing suicide. Why? Because we've just fought Israeli wars. Those wars in Iraq in particular had nothing to do with the national interest of America. That was purely in line with Israeli interests, specifically Oded Yannan's strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And ultimately the breakup of the surrounding Arab nations to Balkanization of the surrounding nations. This is all part of the policy, a long-standing policy.
We will get to that a little bit later. But how does resigning Hagel or Hagel's resignation, whichever you prefer, how does it help Obama in the Middle East?
Well, in the theater of politics, we get the impression that some changes are going to be made. So in the theater, it'll buy a little bit of time. There'll be a debate about who's going to be the next Secretary of Defense, and then whenever that person is nominated, there'll then be opinions about what this person will or won't do, and it'll buy time, but it won't really change anything.
And Republican Senator John McCain, of course, said he knew the Defense Secretary, quote, was frustrated with aspects of the administration's national security policy and decision-making process. What were the events, in your opinion, that frustrated Hagel most, especially in the Syria timeline?
I just find that comical. One, McCain is just an absolute psychopath. He's met.
Why'd you say so?
Well, we've seen the photos of him meeting the so-called moderates in Syria. So apparently, there's some conjecture. I know this hasn't been verified, but maybe he might have even been pictured with al-Baghdadi, the supposed leader of ISIS. But he met with these so-called moderates, who we know these people were working directly with and are actually part of ISIS and al-Nusra Front. There is no real moderates in terms of who would be getting the weapons and fighting Syria. This is a terror proxy war, and John McCain was all over it. And this man, his father, helped cover up the false flag event of the USS Liberty as well. So, the McCain family as a whole is one big load of disgusting traitors, if you ask me. I don't really care what his opinion is on anything. I only look forward to the day where that man is not only kicked out, but arrested for treason. He has helped defy the U.S. Constitution on too many levels to even count.
You're talking here about a former presidential candidate
Indeed.
and a representative of the Republican Party, so...
Indeed, it says a lot about the state of American politics, really. This is the kind of choice you have. McCain, Kerry, Obama, Bush. We're going to have Bush and Clinton again, probably the next. What is this? Is this democracy? I don't think only but the dumbest of the dumb are fooled by that.
Now we are joined by London-based researcher at King's College, Raphael Marcus. Welcome to Straightforward.
Thanks.
What was the central disagreement, in your opinion, between President Obama and the Secretary of Defense throughout his tenure?
Well, I think the impression that we're getting from the reports and all sorts of leaks in the newspapers is that the central disagreement was about Syria and the conflict with ISIS. Chuck Hagel had this famous quote where he says that ISIS is beyond anything that we've seen. And this is at a time when Obama was trying to not minimize but reduce the sort of sensationalist threat coming from ISIS.
Why does Obama tend to do that?
Well, I mean, I think he is a very calculated president, and I think he was gauging American willingness to re-engage in Iraq and Syria. There is no appetite for a re-engagement. And Hagel and Obama were bumping heads on the role of Assad and what the U.S. response should be to Assad if they're going to be carrying out airstrikes in Syria. I think this was the fundamental point, that Obama was always quite opaque on how the airstrikes will affect Assad. And Hagel pushed that the U.S. needs to clarify its position. Are the airstrikes going to facilitate Assad staying in power, or they can facilitate the downfall of ISIS? And the need to clarify that central issue, I think, was the led to some of the friction in the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Raphael, what are the options in the Middle East today, and how would the top person at the Pentagon best deal with the situation, particularly in Syria?
Well, I think coming in, the successor to Hagel is going to be faced with a couple of questions he or she has to ask themselves. Number one is the same issue that plagued Hagel and Obama: is what is the role of Assad? Is it the policy of the U.S. government to allow Assad to continue what he's doing, while the U.S. will continue to strike ISIS? Mm-hmm. The second thing is, what is the scope of American airstrikes? Who are we targeting? Are we going to be targeting? Is the U.S. going to be targeting only ISIS? Is it going to be targeting Jabhat al-Nusra as well? Is it going to be targeting only within Syria, only within Iraq? All the parameters need to be recalibrated. Also, this has to take into account the slightly more muscular opinions of General Dempsey, who's head of the Joint Chiefs. Mm-hmm. The third thing is also this reintroduction of trainers or special forces, American trainers, American special forces on the ground in Iraq. How many, what number will the Iraqi army, Iraqi government be satisfied with? Will the U.S. public be satisfied with? And just one extra point that was of particular friction between Hagel and Obama was the role of troops in Afghanistan now. Hagel was brought in to reduce troop numbers, American troops in Afghanistan. But now we're seeing a freeze in the reductions, and Hagel was brought in to end a war, but now his efforts were sort of stymied because of the deteriorating security situation. Unrelated, this is not related, obviously, to ISIS, but it's just another issue, a big issue that the incoming Secretary of Defense is going to have to deal with.
Yes. Raphael Marcos joined us over the phone from London. Many thanks for sharing your thoughts, and happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks very much.
Kenneth O'Keefe, while some observers believe that Obama's handling in the Middle East is a complete disaster, many argue that he's actually done a good job with no boots on the ground, which means he hasn't cost the Treasury a lot, especially that his main focus initially was the US economy, and that seems to be recovering or on its way to recovery nowadays. So how would you weigh the priorities?
Well, I think the first thing, just going back to the last guest, is that we need to be honest about how American policy actually functions and what the real goals are. The fact is that we effectively created Al-Qaeda. Everybody knows that we armed the Mujahideen. Al-Qaeda was sprung from that. Al-Nusra Front and ISIS, where did they get their weapons from? They get them from our stockpiles of weapons. Where do they get their money from? They get them from our proxies.
Intelligence or facts?
Well, we know, we don't, there's no question the Wahhabi ideology of Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most offensive ideologies on the planet, this perversion of Islam, that Saudi money is going where? It's going to the so-called moderates, but it's also going to these so-called extremists.
But it's not American money. So
no, but it's our allies, and we have great sway over Saudi Arabia and Qatar, great sway over them. We know darn well what they're doing, and we actually want that, because the policy of America, if your greatest expression of power is your military, because America's lost all moral authority, nobody believes America anymore. It's got no moral authority. Its political system is totally bankrupt. The only thing that it really has is military bases all around the world, and it can project its military power and bribe and beat and basically threaten everybody, and that's what it does. Mm-hmm. And in order to justify a continuous war policy, you need a boogeyman. There's always been a boogeyman, always someone to fight. So ISIS is tailor-made for the American policy of empire. And the proxies that we have in Saudi Arabia and Qatar funded these psychopaths while they're beheading people in Iraq and Syria. So this is not an accident. And when I don't hear Chuck Hagel or anybody who's in the president or anyone talk about the fact that our best friends and allies are funding this sort of madness, then I can't take them seriously, because they're not even telling the truth about the way the policy actually functions.
But it is a bit smart, or perhaps a little bit, it's perhaps the first time when you actually get your policy implemented with Arab money without costing the Treasury. So in that sense, he succeeded.
Yeah, he certainly succeeded from an Israeli point of view and from a psychopath's point of view that needs to justify an insanity of empire, which has basically destroyed every place it touches. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Libya, look at Syria. Syria, the Syrian regime, I don't even want to call it that. It is a democratically elected government, albeit in very difficult circumstances. They did have elections. They do have a man who represents the will of the people according to the vote, and that's more than what George Bush could say. He didn't even get the majority of votes in 2000. And Obama's approval ratings are lower than I'm sure Bashar al-Assad's right now as well. So the bottom line is that the policies of America are absolute insanity. It's always about a perpetual war policy. So ISIS is great. And from that respect, yes, I agree with you. Fantastic. Well done. Get our proxies to fund these psychopaths who can run around beheading people to justify yet another return to Iraq and more of this never-ending war. In that sense, I'll agree with you. It's very successful.
And now we are joined by British journalist and lecturer Jonathan Fryer. Welcome to Straightforward.
Hello.
Now, beyond finding a way to close the US prison facility in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba and competently execute a US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the next Secretary of Defense will also have to manage the war against the Islamic State militant group in Iraq and Syria. What needs to be done in Syria, particularly in your opinion, for everyone to assume that the Defense Secretary did it right? Is there a clear line there between right or wrong on Syria?
I don't think anyone's any clear idea about exactly what would be the right policy given the extraordinary mess in which Syria and Iraq and ISIS are now all bound up together, which is very difficult. I mean, I think one of the reasons that Chuck Hagel really had to go, and he was pushed despite officially resigning, was basically because he had been urging a much stronger direct American involvement. He was one of those who believed that actually the United States should intervene to try to oust Bashar al-Assad and his regime, whereas others, including President Obama and Susan Rice, his security advisors, were somewhat more cautious. But I do feel that America has got itself in an almost impossible position. It's very difficult to see how they can get out of what they now are involved in. And having stated that Islamic State is now the enemy and that there is going to be a war that will last not just years but maybe decades, they're basically saying that they're going to be involved, preferably from their point of view, with allies, including, of course, Britain and some of the Arab states.
And back to Senator McCain, who thinks Mr. Obama needed to realize, quote, current failures on national security more often lie with his administration's misguided policies. Is it too much to mention failure as such, and why?
I think it is really. I think it's, that is a good case of Republican kettle calling the Democratic pot black. In other words, that basically for partisan reasons attacking the Obama administration. But as I said, it's very difficult to see what actually a correct and successful U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East would be these days, given that there are so many things that ought to have been done in the past, not least having a more even-handed approach to the Israel-Palestine issue and actually acknowledging the injustice of the Palestinian situation. So it's a very, very complicated situation, and I do feel that Senator McCain is doing a bit of party politics rather than actually constructively saying how could the Obama administration get out of this.
Jonathan Fryer, journalist and lecturer, joined us over the phone from London. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Kenneth O'Keefe, would you have anything to add to that?
Well, there is something we can do, and a lot of people in America know exactly what it is that we can do, and that's what they want. They don't want any more war. As I've said earlier in the program, 22 American servicemen and women are committing suicide every day. Why? Well, because they've been sent over halfway around the world to fight illegal, unjust wars in which they've been asked to kill or be killed, and they've committed great crimes, including killing women and children en masse using depleted uranium and all sorts of horrendous things, torture, and all this sort of stuff. It really, really does destroy the society from inside, and this is the policy of America, never-ending war.
But speaking about war particularly, you've been on the scene during war previously. Can a war be benign anyway, and all very positive and ethical and moral. Things do go wrong at war, and you need to either kill or be killed. So
There is no fair war. There's always rape and plunder in war. I don't care which war you name. But there is a just war and unjust war. Iran, for instance, fought a just war in 1979. 80 when, in the 80s with Iraq. This was an attack in which they had no choice but to defend themselves. And I would argue the same thing for America. If America were legitimately attacked, if somebody was literally breaking down the gates and attacking the United States, then you'd have a right to defend yourself. But we need to look at the false flag strategy, which has been used time and time again. 9/11, I know we don't have time to get into it right now, is a false flag. And that was used to justify these insane policies since 2011, 2001. And look at us now. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2001. There was no Al-Qaeda in Syria back then either. Look at it. Libya as well. There was nothing like that. Look at it. 3 failed states.
Look
really.
where should I look to make sure that you're right?
Well, the evidence is self-evident. Libya is a failed state, very much acknowledged so now. It's absolute chaos over there. We went there to help the Libyans. Iraq, look at it. It's on the verge of a real breakup, which is the goal, by the way, if you go back to Oded United.
How is this always America's fault?
Well, we invaded, didn't we? We're the ones that were pushing for war. We're the ones that propped up the lies about weapons of mass destruction. If we're not responsible, who is? We're most definitely responsible. And according to international law, if you invade and occupy a nation, you are responsible for what happens. In fact, if you go back to the Nuremberg principles, the supreme crime, according to Nuremberg, was wars of aggression. That's the U.S. for you, fighting wars of aggression.
Back to our subject today, speaking about the administration and supposedly misguided policies. Now, do you think criticism would gain momentum and affect perhaps a key player in the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, in her forthcoming potential campaign for the White House? Do you think?
Well, Hillary Clinton, I mean, I honestly, if you just look into that woman's eyes, you can see the psychopath within. I remember her policy.
Your views, of course, they do not represent our channel.
Well, her actions make it pretty clear. When she commented about, very famously, a program in which one of the commentators was talking about how we should go in and take out Iran. And she burst out laughing at the idea of, well, we're working hard about it. She very famously talked about Gaddafi, and after he was basically murdered in the streets, we came, we saw, he died. This kind of stuff is not the kind of thing that the American people need. And it's American sons and daughters whose blood will be spilled, not Hillary Clinton or any of these other blue blood spoiled brats who end up sending American sons and daughters off to war. And I've had enough of it myself as an ex-Marine who served in combat, who knows what war is like. I don't appreciate all these chicken hawks sending American sons and daughters off to war and killing innocent people en masse. And that's what's going to continue to happen with Hillary Clinton, that's for sure.
And now let me welcome English journalist and foreign correspondent Michael Binyon, leader, writer for The Times. Welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you.
Now, some argue that the deep division within the White House means that Obama's new Secretary of Defense must be willing to make his new or her new and aggressive policies work in the 2 years which they would have left to make a mark in the world. Now, speaking of policies and divisions within the establishment, what would have been the case had it been up to the British Prime Minister David Cameron to make this mark in the world?
Well, I think that Britain would not have felt obliged to put boots on the ground, and I don't think that the new Secretary of Defense in America will do that either.
I'm not talking about Britain, I'm talking about the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister, yes. The Prime Minister, equally like Obama, is not committed to Britain's involvement in military action overseas. In fact, he has committed Britain to securing the rebels' victory in Libya, and I think there are some second thoughts now about whether that effort really was worthwhile. He would be hard-pressed, I think, to win over the British public for any military action overseas, and therefore has not attempted to do so, and I don't think will do so. He would prefer to make his mark on the ground with a more vividly humanitarian operation, such as a large British effort for the Ebola victims in West Africa or something of that kind. The challenge is not on our doorstep right now, and therefore I don't think Britain is facing this question of whether Cameron needs to authorize military action anywhere.
And some see that Chuck Hagel's Syria memo to National Security Advisor Susan Rice, in which he allegedly criticized Obama's policy on the Islamic State, could have been in fact a reason behind the Obama's rift and Chuck Hagel's rift, obviously. Yet according to sources familiar with the memo, it was a rather banal affair, very trivial affair. Where do you stand on this and why?
Well, I think the problem is that neither Obama nor Chuck Hagel have any real idea what to do about ISIS. And the split obviously develops over the various proposals. Should we do this? Should we do that? Should we put boots on the ground? Should we actually bomb or step up the bombing of ISIS forces? And obviously, when you can't get either the president or the Secretary of State with a clear policy, you're going to get divergence, disagreement, annoyance. And I think Obama was looking for guidance from his Secretary of Defense as to what to do. When the Secretary of Defense didn't come up with a clear plan or seemed to disagree with whatever was going on in Obama's mind, then I think they felt they simply couldn't work together. It wasn't ever really clear to Chuck Hagel what it was that Obama wanted him to do. Mm-hmm. And I think equally, Obama didn't really know what it was that Chuck Hagel was proposing the Pentagon should do.
And when you mention neither Obama or Hagel knew what to do about Syria particularly, could you name someone from their critics, especially Obama's critics, that could have done the job better in America?
I think that's very hard to do. I don't think at the moment there's any Western politician or any senior political figure, either in America or in Europe, who really knows what would be an effective, popular, and responsive attitude to take to ISIS. If one says that they should be left to fight their own wars, then clearly you're sacrificing the lives of thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent people, and particularly religious minorities in the region who are their victims. If, on the other hand, you say that intervention is necessary, then you get the military question. Intervention where, for whom, and what is the military exit strategy? Nobody really has a clear answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Michael Roger Binion, serving as the Times Moscow correspondent, as well as reporting from Berlin, Washington, and all over the Middle East. Many thanks for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And back to you, Kenneth O'Keefe. Former Undersecretary of Defense Michelle O'Fleury said she was taking herself out of consideration because of family concerns in case the president decided to appoint her for the next top Pentagon job. What do you have to say about that? Has it become a little bit too murky in the Middle East for anyone to deal with the situation, just like what our guest Michael Binion suggested a bit earlier?
Well, whoever it is that is going to entertain taking the position is going to inherit a policy which has been very static and very, very clear-cut. And that's why we have the disaster we have today. And I don't imagine for a second that any new Secretary of Defense is going to substantially have the ability to change the policy. The policy is never-ending war, this ISIS creation. We have a lot of sway, a lot of power. To say that we don't have influence over Saudi Arabia and Qatar and we were training these people. Israel, it's been very well reported at this point, has been giving medical attention to ISIS fighters in the Golan Heights and even in Tel Aviv. This has been reported.
Could that not be considered humanitarian relief?
Would they give Al-Qaeda humanitarian relief as well? And isn't it curious how ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front have never once has Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front or ISIS attacked one state. Guess what? Israel. Isn't that strange? It seems like Israel is benefiting tremendously from ISIS. In fact, it seems like it's very, very beneficial for Israel and the American empire that ISIS has come up, because we do, after all, need a boogeyman to fight, and there we have it. If we didn't have a boogeyman, then what would we do? Maybe we might stop helping our buddies in Saudi Arabia, who are the most offensive regime on the planet, stop allowing them to fund this Wahhabi ideology, which is translating to beheadings and torture and insanity in Iraq. And this has been happening for years. And every U.S. president and every single administrative official in the White House who doesn't know this is beyond criminally incompetent. These people actually need to be charged with some serious crimes if they honestly don't know what's happening. And I really don't suspect for one second that the next Secretary of Defense will be able to change anything.
But do you think this support through Saudi to the Islamists and the radicals will ever have an expiry date when it comes to U.S. foreign policy? Would they cut it at some point?
Absolutely, yes. Just like Saddam Hussein was our best friend and ally when he was useful, look at him now. The Saudi regime is going to go down hard. I have no question of that, no doubt about it at all. And the petrodollar system, which has effectively propped up the Saudi regime and America and allowed it to build military bases all around the world, that's living on borrowed time. So when the petrodollar system is gone and America's false economy, false prosperity no longer exists, and it has to play on a level playing field with all of its moral authority gone, there's no question whatsoever that these policies will end. The question is, will it end in a third world war? And that's actually where these policies are leading us. I mean, when you look at Syria, what would happen very predictably if you took out Bashar al-Assad right now? That's going to create a vacuum.
You tell us.
Well, who's going to fill the vacuum of Bashar al-Assad being
vacuum
God?
Or
a political vacuum,
or...
a power vacuum. That's going to be filled by the most powerful interests there. And who's that? Those are the people running around with M16s and Jeeps supplied by the United States to our so-called moderate rebels in Syria and also in Iraq and whatnot. That's where they got these weapons. They don't make their own weapons. They get it from us. They also got training in Jordan from us.
This is a known fact. But then you say Saudi. You mean us via Saudi?
U.S. Special Forces were giving training in Jordan in secret bases over there. We also know very well that the Turks are shuttling in ISIS fighters. This is one of Press TV's reporters, Serena Shim, was just murdered, all too likely by the Turkish government in some form or shape, intelligence services, because she was exposing the fact that Turkey, our good friend and ally as well, is shuttling ISIS fighters in and out of there, which they have an interest in that as well, because they've been saying for years now that there is no such thing as sovereignty, no such thing as self-determination, that the Syrian people don't count, and the fact that they voted in Bashar al-Assad doesn't matter, that he needs to be taken out. All of these policies are very, very much insane, but they're meant to be, because the chaos is what is needed to justify America's never-ending war policy.
Mm-hmm. And now we are joined by Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson, show host joining us from Los Angeles. Happy Thanksgiving and welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving to you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much. Michael Young writes, quote, "The greater problem is that Obama's policies in the Middle East have primarily been built not around principles or objectives, but around avoidance." Do you agree with this?
Absolutely, 100%. Barack Obama is an appeaser, and he's been trying to please our enemies and give the impression that we are not a superpower nation. And as a result, he has hurt the country rather than helping it. He has weakened us.
Yes, and an editorial in Dubai's Gulf News newspaper argues that even if Hagel did get caught up in fighting for the troops he was supposed to be commanding, he was also isolated as the sole Republican in a cabinet that is dominated by Obama's cronies from his early days in Chicago. To what extent is this true? To what extent Obama got his cronies to the cabinet?
You know, it is absolutely true. Hagel is a hardliner. He believes that America is a strong nation and that we are the superpower. Obama doesn't. And by working with Obama cronies like Susan Rice and others, it was hard for him to do the job that he needed to do. And they isolated him. He would sit in meetings and had nothing to say because they had isolated him. He was not one of them. It was difficult for him to do his job.
Mm-hmm. And how would you comment on Obama's knowledge when it comes to foreign policy compared to another candidate that you may suggest would have done the job better?
Barack Obama is a community organizer.
What do you mean?
He's not a warrior.
What do you mean?
He doesn't mean that he doesn't have the courage to fight. He doesn't have the courage to deal with a radical terrorist group like ISIS and others, compared to George W. Bush or even Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was stronger than Barack Obama when it comes to fighting our enemies. Obama doesn't have that in him. He's really not the type of guy that appreciates the power of America. He has a resentment against this country, and his primary mission is to weaken us. He's not a real warrior.
Excuse me, Reverend, but are we talking about the same George Bush who went AWOL during the Vietnam War, who got a cushy job with the Air National Guard because his daddy gave him that job? This same man who sent many thousands of American servicemen off to their deaths in an unjust, illegal war in Iraq based on a pack of lies, the same man who announced mission accomplished. Are we seriously talking about this man doing a better job than Barack Obama? Don't you see them both as equally worthless?
No, the way you would describe President George Bush is wrong, but I am talking about that guy. President Bush had brought peace to Iraq for the first time, and Obama, when
that's
he became
not
president,
it. There is no peace in Iraq, and I'm dumbfounded that anybody can't see the truth about what we've done to Iraq. There's 1 million to 2 million dead in that country, millions of orphans, millions of refugees. The infrastructure's been destroyed. It's on the brink of being broken up into 3 pieces. You've got sectarian divide like nothing. Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq when we invaded, but now they're all over the place. Now they're called ISIS, cutting off heads, and also I can't believe that you say there's peace in Iraq. How can you possibly say that?
Why are you speaking over me? You're trying to prevent the truth from getting out. And the truth is that had Obama not poured all of the truth out of Iraq, the people there would have peace today. But because he poured them out, we now have chaos. Barack Obama refused to stop ISIS when he had a chance to do it. They were in the desert.
Why do you think, Reverend Peterson, why do you think Obama skipped this chance or missed this chance to get rid of ISIS, so to say, despite Hillary Clinton's advice back then, Secretary of State?
Well, 2 reasons. One is that he's a coward, and secondly, Barack Obama resents America and he resents Israel. He resents the fact that Israel and America are superpowers, that they have been in control for a long time, years.
Wow,
years.
I'm absolutely shocked that a reverend, first off...
And because of his resentment for that, he's not doing what he should be doing to protect the country.
You know, I left America in 2001, and I've known for a long time the psyche of American people, so it doesn't surprise me, but you really literally live on an alternate reality. This is insane. First off, George Bush is a deserter, and if I'm an ex-Marine, and I'll tell you what, in a time of war, if I had deserted like he did for over a year, guess what? I would have been thrown in the brig. But in America, apparently, we reward that type of cowardice with the position of commander-in-chief. You've got 22 American servicemen a day committing suicide. Are you happy with that? That is a result of George Bush's policy. I don't like chicken hawks who send off American sons and daughters to fight illegal wars and then put them in a position where they feel like they have no way out but to commit suicide. Apparently, you'd like to send more American sons and daughters. Have you ever served in a war, my sir? Have you ever actually been in combat? Why do you want to send more American sons and daughters off for another illegal war? I don't understand.
You are a dishonest man in your dialogue. That's why you're shouting.
Tell me what's dishonest about what I just said.
President George Bush is not a deserter. He is a warrior.
He did not show up to work in the military for over a year. That is the definition of absent without leave. You are wrong, and I will debate you on this if you like.
I am not wrong. President
You're
Bush
dead wrong.
had Iraq,
literally.
Al-Qaeda.
He's a coward and a chicken hawk.
President Bush had Al-Qaeda on the run when he left office. Now Al-Qaeda and Iraq have joined forces. They are more powerful today under Barack Obama than they were President Bush. And then because of Barack Obama, he have allowed terrorists to come into our country. And instead of calling it what it is, he gives it another name. He doesn't say terrorism. He calls them gangs. He calls them thugs. Barack Obama is not an honest man. He's a weak president, and we are paying a price for it.
So you want more war, more dead American sons and daughters committing suicide. You want to favor Israel committing ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians. You want all of that. I'm ashamed that you, as a public person, would have such a view. And I can assure you that the sons and daughters who fought in these wars supported one man for president, and that was Ron Paul. You know why? Because he would have got us out of these illegal wars and out of the empire agenda that is really the end of America altogether. America does have something good called the U.S. Constitution, which has been defiled left, right, and center, and I'm more concerned about that. I'd like to see America clean up its own dirty, filthy house instead of sticking its nose in other people's business, always based on a pack of lies.
Israel has not done ethnic cleansing. Israel's
wiped hundreds of villages off the map of Palestine. That is indefensible, illegal.
Let's listen to Reverend Peterson. Just let him speak a little bit.
Thank you. Israel has participated. It has given up land, and the Palestinians do not want land. The fight is not about land. The fight is about killing the Jews. They want to push Israel into the ocean, just as they want to destroy America because they see Israel as the infidels as well as America. It's not
I can't
about
help
land.
myself but say
It's
that you are an
about
absolute
killing.
idiot. And I
It's
have been
about
to
killing.
Palestine. I
respect all
have
views.
lived in Palestine. I have met these people firsthand.
care what
You
you
have
do.
no knowledge of what you're talking about at all. The Palestinians
I
committed
have
no
absolute
crime
knowledge
at
of what
all
I'm
and were
talking about.
dispossessed of their land. My father-in-law, my wife's father,
Why are
is
you
one of the
screaming?
1948 Palestinians who was forced out of Jaffa, which is now part of Israel. You don't know a damn thing about your history. And the Palestinian people are amongst the most
Why
remarkably
don't you calm
patient
down,
and
sir?
hospitable people that you'll ever meet on this planet. And it isn't about Jew or Muslim. It has nothing to do about that. It is all about the theft of land and the dispossession of people's rights. The American people
Israel
would
has
fight
tried-
tooth and nail if they had to
Israel
endure the
has
same thing the
tried for
Palestinians
years-
have.
Israel
Incredible.
has tried for years to make peace with the Palestinians. It is impossible to do it. So
Why is it
Israel at
impossible,
this point-
Reverend Peterson? In your opinion, why do you
because-
think it's impossible?
Because the Palestinians want Israel dead. They hate the Jews, they hate the Christians, they hate America, and they want to push, as I said, Israel into the ocean. They don't want peace.
There really is
There's no way that
no way to
Israel
address it other
can
than
make
that.
peace.
Pure insanity
There's
and
no
total
way
idiocy.
Israel can make peace with its enemy. They do not want peace. So Israel has no choice now but to defend herself because these people want to kill them. And unfortunately, Israel is not getting support from Obama. In my opinion, Obama supports the Palestinians more than he does Israel. And that's so unfortunate. For the first time, Israel friend, the American, doesn't have the same relationship that we had prior to Barack Obama. And that's unfortunate.
Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson, we respect all views on the show, and thank you very much for joining us. You are the show host and president of bondaction.org. Joined us from Los Angeles. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving to you guys.
Thank you very much. No matter how experienced or good a defense secretary is at the job, he or she will be responsible for implementing policies forged elsewhere. If the White House is indecisive or reverses itself on key decisions, senior cabinet members can get caught in the stumble. And from an array of talented but flawed candidates, the US President now needs to make the hard choice of how to replace Chuck Hagel. And as this episode comes to an end, I'd like to thank our guest here at the studio, Mr. Kenneth O'Keefe, and our guests who joined us over the phone, Mr. Rafael Marcos of King's College, and Mr. Jonathan Fryer of SOAS, and Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson, and Mr. Michael Binyamin. And stay tuned, and I'll be with you soon again on Straightforward. And John Sopel, the BBC's North America editor, believes that after midterm political defeats, the president needed a military win. Can we really assert when it comes to political defeats that the P5+1 was a failure?
Well, I don't think it's a failure at all in terms of what the real policy is. Now, the stated policy and the real policy is almost always two very different things. The real policy, not the stated one, the real policy is to punish Iran, and that punishment has been carried forward since the 1979 revolution, in which they kicked out our puppet, the Shah. And also they have the audacity to exercise their sovereignty by exercising another right, which is the right to produce nuclear power. And we look at Israel and the policy towards Israel and the sheer hypocrisy of the inspections for Iran and none for Israel. We see that Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons, has even threatened to use those weapons against non-nuclear states. And we see that the policies of the United States have been consistent in protecting Israel and other imperial policies. Chuck Hagel made no difference whatsoever. The next Secretary of Defense, whoever it is, won't make any difference either.
Strategy to fight ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
Kenneth O'Keefe, California Republican Howard McKeon said, he also chairs the House of Armed Services Committee. He said that when the president goes through 3 secretaries of defense, he should ask himself, is it them or is it me? What do you think?
Well, indeed, it's all about image, really. I don't see any major change in policy from the Secretary of Defense position from Donald Rumsfeld and previous to that as well. really the policy remains quite consistent. You hear about Chuck Hagel being referred to as a no-nonsense kind of guy. Well, that was the hope, and as an ex-Marine myself, an enlisted Marine, not an officer, which Chuck Hagel is the first Secretary of Defense to actually be an enlisted Marine, a working man's military man, or an enlisted serviceman. There was hope that he would reflect the interests of the people, the boots on the ground, as it were. He didn't do that at all. He carried on the same insane policies which have led to the creation of ISIS, which under his watch, ISIS grew further.
Handling over ISIS, while other reports claim that Hagel's exit resulted from conflicts with National Security Advisor Susan Rice and a lack of confidence in his management skills at the Pentagon. White House officials speaking to the press on conditions of anonymity said that the president's removal of Chuck Hagel was, quote, a recognition that the Islamic State would require a different set of skills than those Hagel was brought on to employ. In an interview with a Phoenix area radio station, Senator John McCain said Hagel was very frustrated with the Obama administration's foreign policy strategy in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, adding that Hagel was, quote, never really brought into the tight circle that makes all the decisions. Hagel, a Vietnam War veteran and former Republican senator, is to stay on until his successor is confirmed, with Robert Work, Ashton Carter and the former Pentagon policy chief during Mr. Obama's first term, Michelle Flournoy, as potential replacements. Whether Mr. Hagel was pressured to leave office or chose to resign still remains speculation, but what implications will his resignation have for the Middle East, and will it impact the administration's
Hello and welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political talk show focusing on the Middle East. Chuck Hagel, described as, quote, a no-nonsense defense secretary, has resigned. President Barack Obama discussed with him the appropriate time to complete his service. He was also the one Republican in the White House national security setup. But that may be of lesser importance than him being appointed to do one task in the Pentagon, only to find out that the job description has changed fundamentally. He was the man appointed to bring the troops home and pare back the huge defense budget. But then Islamic State came along and all the calculations changed, and Mr. Obama and his defense chief found themselves at odds. There was a lack of clear strategy, perhaps because Mr. Obama and Mr. Hagel did not agree on what it should be. And after midterm political defeats, the president needs a military win. So a change at the top will be an important symbol of that determination. But will this help the president repolish his image, particularly when it comes to foreign policy? Let me first welcome our guest here at the studio, Mr. Kenneth O'Keefe, a former United States Marine and Gulf War veteran and commentator. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I shall wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And before we get into our discussion, let's have a look at this brief report on recent events in Washington.
On Monday, US President Barack Obama announced that Chuck Hagel would be stepping down as the US Secretary of Defense, just less than 2 years after taking the post. The announcement came as no surprise to many, as US media had reported of rising tensions between the White House and Mr. Hagel over issues regarding the Middle East. At the end of October, Hagel had written a memo to the White House which was said to be highly critical of Obama's perceived fight against ISIS and his lack of strategy towards Syria. The New York Times suggested that Chuck Hagel was stepping down under pressure due to his